And now we would like to welcome our first witness, Simone Watson. Welcome, Simone.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's an honour to be here. I'd just like to acknowledge the passing of an incredible feminist activist, campaigner, Yalna Hanma. I'd been hoping to meet her this year along with about a million other people, and I'd just like to acknowledge the significant, groundbreaking and important work that she did for women and girls.
Thank you so much. And now that you talk about acknowledging, of course, we too acknowledge here that we are on First Nations people's land, and we appreciate that we can be here. And you are in Western Australia, I understand, and therefore are in that part of Australia which was conserved and preserved by the First Nations people of that part of the country. So now, would you like?
That's right. I'm on Pibbleman Minang country in Western Australia, and yeah, it's an honour to be here.
Lovely, thank you. And could you just introduce yourself by telling us a little about your background and work?
Sure. My name's Simone Watson, and my background work is activism in the abolition of prostitution. I'm a sex trade survivor, so this is the perspective from which I'm coming from, but also I've been working for at least 10 years with researchers on this, so I have gathered more expertise. My background in this is that I read Amnesty International's proposal to quote unquote decriminalise sex work, as they call it, and when I read that documentation that implied pretty strongly that men have a right to buy sexual access to women's bodies, I thought that can't be correct, and that's where I'm coming from today.
I would like to ask you, Simone, how you first became involved and aware of the difficulties facing women in this area. You talked about the Amnesty International report that triggered your concern, and then you became aware of the difficulties in terms of where you were living at the time.
How I became aware of problems for women in prostitution was being in prostitution. The amnesty stuff came later because I thought they couldn't possibly mean that they want to empower this group of men more. So how I first became involved and aware of the difficulties that women faced in this area was living it. And one of the main areas, of course, was that you were kind of inured to the violence of the men. It was the police and the stigma and discrimination that women in prostitution face that really had me mainly concerned. Wherever you were, you had to be concerned about your legality. If you were doing something criminal, of course, the responsibility was completely placed on you, and never on the men who were perpetrating the violence. So that's how I first became aware of this being a major problem for women. There was this unequal distribution of power and coming up against the law. While police might turn a blind eye, they will definitely focus on the victim rather than the perpetrator of violence, because of course there's sort of one of you, there are multiple of him, and it's easier to round up prostituted women and fine and harass them than it is to actually go after the perpetrators of violence.
Thank you.
How is Australia's implementation of its obligations pursuant to CEDAW improved since it was first adopted, or since it first adopted CEDAW in 1980? And what has improved for women over the last 50 years, and what has become worse?
I'm trying to think how things have improved for women in the area of this particular form of violence. sexual violence against women. It seems to become far more legitimised. So decriminalising the women selling sexual access to their bodies is a no-brainer. So that should count as a positive, I suppose. The rest has gone completely backwards because the trajectory is to legitimise the violent cohort of men who enact this violence against women. So we're expanding that cohort. So I can't see how Australia is doing anything but going determinedly, not just backwards in our obligations, but actively going against against Article 6 of CEDAW.
Yes.
So pushes for full decriminalisation of the sex trade are couched in the language of decriminalising sex work, which is a focus on the person selling the sexual access. What it really means is decriminalising male violence. And if you call it something else, then suddenly it's not a crime. So generally the people think that if you're decriminalising sex work, that means that you're decriminalising the women. Well, it's obvious, isn't it? If a woman's in a situation of domestic violence, you wouldn't criminalise her. So you wouldn't criminalise the women who are doing this to survive or put food on the table. But in doing that, you completely decriminalise the men committing the violence or the perpetrator, which is very convenient for him. And, of course, those who profit from, like the pimps and the brothel owners. So Australia is going backwards, and I think going directly against what it ratified, what it promised the world that it would do, which was to end violence against women and this particular form of discrimination that we are uniquely singled out for.
Right. Thank you for that, Simone. So question 7, how has Australia's implementation of its obligations pursuant to CEDAW improved since its last report back to CEDAW in 2018? And what has improved for women over the past 5 years? And what has gotten worse?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm glad that it's, that we're at 2018 because things obviously got worse with the pandemic, and we've also had further decriminalisation of this form of male violence in 2019 in the Northern Territory, which is the largest population of Indigenous people per capita. And Victoria's gone from a somewhat legislated model of prostitution to a fully decriminalised model. Of course, New South Wales has been a hellhole for a while and a long time prior to that regards to this. And now Queensland is pushing to further decriminalise this cohort of men and the way in which pimps and the state can profit from it. So the pandemic really threw into stark relief just how drastically awful things are for women in prostitution. For example, a woman I know who's currently in prostitution thought that she was getting support during that period because a government-funded pro-sex trade lobby group called the Scarlet Alliance gave her $300. So that was what she got for being forced into poverty during a trying situation globally, right? And I thought if we had a Nordic equality model system, a system of asymmetric criminalisation where this violence against women is just considered utterly unacceptable, she would have had, as would every other woman in prostitution, access to the same supports as everybody else, but more because she's a victim of trauma. And it was just thrown into stark relief. And also that there were sort of desperate videos being made and documents being released by these government-funded bodies saying to keep safe during prostitution, you had to keep like social distancing during the pandemic while you were meant to be having sex with somebody, or what they call sex. So they would give advice like use antibacterial wipes, don't tie your hair back to keep out of your face, which of course creates a way where men can grab you more easily from behind, and that you're meant to physically keep your distance while he's trying to penetrate you. So it just highlighted for me how uncared for and how actively put in danger women in prostitution are, and also that we're the first women to get arrested by the police for breaching any of the quarantine laws. Like the men queuing up to buy access to women were not being arrested. And so the women, the most marginal women, were getting fined for the behaviour of men breaching pandemic legislation. So now with Queensland further legitimising men's violence in this way in 2023, I think we have the opportunity to tell Australia, the federal government, that it needs to investigate and interrogate how we could have possibly done this, to interrogate Australia as a society that would allow this to happen to women generally, and why would we ratify this particular convention if we insisted that there should be a caste of women available for sexual access. So all of the reasons why Australia should not be decriminalising further were thrown into relief. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. Yes, Helen.
I just have to declare that Simone is a very good friend of mine, and that we think about things together very often, and we've written a submission recently to the Commonwealth Government on consent. So I don't want to hide anything. I'm very proud of that and honoured and happy with that connection, but I don't want somebody to come to me and say, but you know her. Well, of course I do. We do. So
I appreciate your ethical research in this area, and I'm very proud of that document that we worked on together. Thank you, Helen.
I was thinking perhaps you could refer a little bit to it as well, because the question that I want to ask you is, how is Australia's failure to meet its obligations under CEDAW affecting women you know or assist? But one of the things that I think you might like to just talk a little bit about, or I think would be useful for you to talk a little bit about in terms of conveying the evidence, is you refer to prostitution as male violence. Now, we know that violence, there are many violent acts, and we know that because of the reports of violent acts against women in prostitution. And we also know that through the rates of PTSD, which is the primary cause, as found by researchers, pro-sex work researchers at that, is the threat and the reality of violent acts against women in prostitution. But one of the things that I think people are less familiar with, and I don't mean to be condescending in saying this, but I think it is the case, is the notion that prostitution is violence, is male sexual violence. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that in that context of what obligations that we have under CEDAW. If it is violence, what do we need to do? So it's systemic violence, I think you're saying, rather than simply, as well as individual acts of violence. I hope I phrased it properly.
Yeah, it's definitely part of it's systemic violence, of course, especially when the state becomes involved to legitimise it. Once you've legitimised it, then you have committed to the fact that you think that the women should and can be used in this way. It is individualised violence because it's happening to your body. It's not an abstract concept, prostitution. You will know as well as anybody, and I discuss this a lot with people when they talk about men who visit prostitutes or visit sex workers. It's not what men do. They don't visit with us. They, excuse my language, they come to fuck us. So I would like to individualise it as well for the women, for example, who they would call quote unquote migrant sex workers. Personally, it's so inutterably offensive to say that it is a woman's right to come to this country on the proviso that she's stuck dick. Why are we not supporting women that I know who desperately need support in this country? Why aren't we supporting her not to be deported and thrown into a detention centre because she's supposedly here illegally? If prostitution is sex work, it can be deported on the fact that she doesn't have a valid working visa, but on the other hand, this is meant to be a job like any other. I think that vulnerable women like my friends who are treated so abominably by the police, the Australian government and the pro-sex trade lobbyists themselves, should be told that they are safe here without the conditions of needlessly putting themselves and their families in danger back home or in the home they've created here by having forced to testify against him and so on. They shouldn't be being told that they're allowed to stay in this country if they suck Australian men's dicks. So I can only be as blunt as that.
Thank you,
I could be blunter, sorry. I could be blunter than that, but I can only be as polite as that because that's what this is really all about.
Thanks, Simone. My question is, what needs to change now and how can these changes best be achieved? And you do mention a Royal Commission in your witness statement.
Yes, I did. I do mention a Royal Commission because I think the findings would be enlightening. But of course, as we know, these things take a very long time and too long to and if it was going to take 20 years before people realised that men don't have a right to impart and enact sexual violence on women's bodies just because they pay for it, we're not going to get anywhere. So we really need to adopt the Nordic Equality Model, which is a legislation based on criminalising those who enact the violence, and criminalising the victims of that violence. It's not a necessity for, under the UN Convention, as far as I understand, you might clarify this for me, for a person to necessarily see themselves as a victim. Often we'll see this in situations of domestic violence. The women will stay, as we all know, because they quote unquote choose to. I think we make decisions, obviously, within the choices that we have available to us. So if we have a model, a legislative model and a policy model as well, which means that people need to adopt it, understand it, be trained around it and act it, like the law enforcement, social workers, community more broadly, then understand that this is a form of that this is violence against women and male sexual entitlement, then we can better support women from staying out, remaining out of the sex trade, but also not getting into it in the first place, because the first option for a woman who is struggling or needing to earn a living, heaven forbid, shouldn't have to be that she be sexually used and abused by men in this country. And further, I would have men who do this to women outside the country criminalised as well. It's dishonourable and degrading and reflects so appallingly on this already colonised racist country that I don't think that we can continue this way. I think it needs to be taken very seriously. We can use the research we have on the cohort of men who use women in prostitution. It these studies have been done and they conclusively say that what you legitimise expands because it's socialised into the culture, it can expand, and that this cohort of men, unsurprisingly, lack empathy and are more misogynistic and more quote-unquote sexually coercive, which is a nice way of putting it, than men who don't use women in prostitution, given that the majority of men don't actually in the flesh physically buy women in prostitution. They use screen-mediated prostitution in the form of pornography, but if we're just talking about what happens in the brothels to women individually, one man after the other, the majority of men don't do this, but we find that this cohort of men more men do, where you legitimise it. So we don't want to expand the entitlement of these men, and we don't want to grow the sociopathy in a generation of men coming up to feel that they're entitled to do this. So if we enact the Nordic equality model, we can enact that cultural shift, which I think is very crucial, which has happened in Sweden and is happening in France and so on, where men are saying, hang on, if you have to pay someone to have sex with them, it means they don't want to have sex with you. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to pay. So the money is not seen as consent. The money is seen for what it is, which is a way to circumvent consent and to suspend a woman's right to say no in that period of time. So the Nordic equality legislation is the best that we can aim for, and I think we need to hold Australia accountable in doing that.
Thank you, Simone. And now over to Kerry Hubel for question 10.
Now, finally, I think they might have one more after me. What recommendations would you like the CEDAW Committee to make?
To do what I just said, and that is to, within the power, those who are responsible for holding the states and to account, to do whatever they can in their power, and every individual who can influence this in whatever, to adopt the Nordic equality model, to make a really strong stance against this and stand up and say men do not have the right to do this. In what universe is this acceptable? In what universe are we able to ratify conventions to eliminate discrimination if we are not going to help the most marginalised women? I mean, if one woman can be in prostitution, that means all women are up for grabs in prostitution. Everyone can be. Everyone's just like a pay packet away from being used, and if CEDAW could come out strongly to Australia and say, look, you need to do this to not be a laughing stock of the world, really. I mean, Australia's considered in so many ways to be so backwards and in other ways to be forward thinking, and I think that we have a tendency to hold ourselves up as more forward thinking in this regard than we are, obviously, because if we were, we wouldn't be legitimising men to do this. So my recommendation to CEDAW was to exert pressure on the individual states and territories, but to get the federal government, of course, to do that, to interrogate why people would adopt the legislation, which the research indicates is actually appalling for women and girls, both in this country and globally. We have a commitment internationally to hold our.
Sorry. Would you just briefly explain what is the Nordic model that you feel that we should be looking at?
Yeah, sure. It's an asymmetric model of criminalisation legislation, so that the women, by using the term women, I'm being inclusive of anyone who's selling sexual access to their bodies, are completely decriminalised, so that the person is treated legally as a victim of a crime of violence. So in that regard, you're not treated as a perpetrator or a criminal. If there is a victim of a crime, obviously there is a perpetrator. So that would be the man, usually a man, would say 100% of the time it's a man, is criminalised for committing that act of violence against you. So he would be accountable under the law, now, including within that Nordic Model framework is policy to support the woman out of that situation, which of course should be victim survivor centred. So what she needs at the time. There is a lot of focus on pushing women who are trying to escape prostitution into what the state wants her to be doing, but we need to give women time to recuperate and recover from prostitution like we do with domestic violence situations, where we may need to go in and out, like back and forth from that until we finally leave, but be supported each step of the way to get out, to give women a time to rest and recover, to make sure that she has her housing, her rent paid for at least a year. If she wants therapy, she gets therapy. If she doesn't, we respect her right to do that. So the Nordic equality model should encapsulate those kind of services, and definitely decriminalising her, because we know why she's there. What's his excuse? He doesn't have one, except for sexual entitlement, and in this cohort of men, a particular propensity towards violence against women. So yeah, that's. I hope I explained that correctly.
Yes, thank you.
So we do have about 10 minutes time for extra questions. And I actually did just want to refer to your comments on COVID-19, because there would have been men who ordinarily would have used and abused women in the prostitution industry during that period, but who did actually go along with the law. Or we also know that during that period, criminal assault at home and other forms of domestic violence rose. And I'm just wondering whether, I mean, there would have been a number of reasons for that, but whether part of the reason was that rather than going to women who were prostituted in order to inflict the violence upon that cohort, they actually inflicted it on the woman that they had at home. Do you think that could have been part of the reason for the rise in violence in terms of criminal assault at home and other forms of domestic violence?
I wonder about that, because I think it could be that men were just simply using prostituted women more, but in a screen-mediated form via the pornography. If you remember, Pornhub offered access to their premium services, they're disgusting, for free. So you didn't just have access to free pornography, you could get like the stuff that you normally were meant to pay for. So it makes me wonder, I mean, if they're committing violence against women in prostitution as some kind of safety valve, do you think, for other women? It doesn't tend to work like that. It tends to, the more that you would use a woman in prostitution over a period of time, the more likely you were going to enact it against the women generally. I realise there tends to be a societal compartmentalisation, that the violence against women over here doesn't bleed into violence against women over there. But as you point out, they're the same continuum, right? So I don't know, but my theory would be that men were accessing more pornography. They weren't out of the home when they were accessing the pornography, so they were enacting it. And it does come, because it's legitimised, this form of prostitution, the sense of entitlement to do it or to use it, it grows with that availability. So, yeah, the increase in violence against women means just that you're in physical proximity to the perpetrator for longer periods of time. So if he's not out there and if he's perpetrating it at home to some extent and he's not able to perpetrate it more widely in the world, then of course they're going to get a concentrated amount of violence, which is a strange way to sum it up. But it's concentrated in the home in this way. So he's still using women in prostitution. He's just doing it via screen, and that plus the extra frustrations that she might be feeling, as in she's not particularly happy being locked up either, seem to go unheeded. And yeah, it's a greater concentration of being closer to a perpetrator means that you're going to, of course, experience him doing that, because that's where he will be. He will be with you committing that violence. Perpetrator, yeah.
I just really must to emphasise here that never, I know you weren't implying it, but it came into my mind, never ever would I buy into that absolute lie that we need to have the prostitution industry to save the women at home from the, sexual exploitation and so on, which is an absolute lie, but it's used as a justification.
Yeah, and I knew that's where you were. I knew that's where you were coming from. I realised we were running out of time, but I do remember this being really young and seeing a movie called The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, which I think is now available on Netflix, with the wonderful, beautiful Dolly Parton and all these people who know nothing really about prostitution, but are lovely people saying, yeah, if we don't have this, more women will get raped. Like real women will get raped, right? It's just, I realise that's wasn't what you were doing, but I think people don't even know they're thinking that sometimes. And
I have to say,
I'm glad. No, I knew that you weren't, but I'm glad that you raised it, because anyone watching or listening to this who might have thought that, it's important that you made that comment, because it gets people to think about it, and I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. And we've got a few more minutes, but I want to say too that what you just said is really absolutely important too, in that you used the word rape, that if there weren't women being prostituted, then the men would be out there raping. So what that actually is saying is that they're raping the women who are being prostituted. And that in order, and it's so wicked, really, essentially wicked in terms of its acceptance of abuse of women. Yeah, but I think we've got about 3 minutes. So does somebody have another burning question we'd like to put to Simone?
I've probably got a million questions, Simone, but I can't formulate them right now. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm very pleased and honoured to be part of it, and I would like to thank you very much for your work for women and girls. It's crucial that we do this, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
One thing, I used to work many years ago with the Women's Advisory Council, and I took submissions for a prostitution inquiry at that point from prostitutes who were invited to contact me, and anonymously if they so wished. And it was definitely an eye-opener to me, and it was very much along the lines of what you're talking about now.
But it was 50 years ago, 50 years ago, and we're still, 70s, 1970. It was 50 years ago. 50 years ago, and it's still.
Well, I mean, the behaviour of the men hasn't changed. They still want blowjobs, right? Nothing else has changed. And you can use Dr. Pringle touched on this. You can use the study and the research from the pro-sex trade lobbies who want to expand this violence. You can use their own evidence to show you that the violence against women that was happening then is happening now.
Exactly.
Yeah. Could I just, one thing that just struck me, and this is just really a very quick comment, and I think you probably agree, but one of the things is with the government having, and the government is the state, and it is the state that is responsible under CEDAW, with the government having responsibility and having a plan for violence against women, perhaps we should notice, there is no provision or no special consideration in that strategy for women in prostitution.
Yeah, good.
And that would be I think you put, again, I mean, I always kind of get ideas put in my head through speaking with you, but
There is the
struck me
recommendation.
as a great proposal that we could make straight away, isn't it?
It is, and I think in 11, in the issues around prostitution, in number 11, they said to decriminalise the women, you know, in prostitution, or they would have put it sex workers. That's the language that would have been used. And we, of course, you start there. You just don't decriminalise the men who are doing the raping and the bashing, are paying to do it. So I think that is in there. I'm not. You could check that, but I think it was part of 11C or something. In maybe in the list of issues, but. Thank you, Helen. Yes, more things come to mind.
Good. Thanks so much, Simone. We really appreciate it. And say farewell as you go off down to work at 9 o'clock.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Great.
Appreciate it. Bye.
Bye-bye then. Bye.